The folded letter trembled in the woman's hands. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the quiet cabin. "Just look." Callum Ashford had heard every kind of plea a man could hear in 39 years. He had heard men beg for another chance after losing everything at cards. He had heard ranch hands plead for work during hard winters. He had heard neighbors ask for help after floods, fires, and droughts. But there was something different about this woman's voice. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't desperate. It sounded like someone carrying the weight of years she didn't fully understand. He stood near the stone fireplace, his weathered hat resting in one hand. The evening fire threw warm amber light across the cabin walls, filling the room with the scent of pine logs and fresh coffee. Outside, rain still drummed softly against the roof. Neither of them moved. The woman stood beside the heavy pine table, her travel cloak still damp from the storm. Loose strands of auburn hair framed a face that looked exhausted from weeks, perhaps months, of travel. She carefully laid a folded envelope on the table. Beside it, she placed a faded photograph, then something wrapped in a small linen cloth. "I don't know if any of this belongs to you," she said quietly, "but my grandmother made me promise I wouldn't throw it away." Callum remained where he was. For 12 years, anything connected to his family had brought more pain than answers. He wasn't eager to reopen old wounds. "My name is Rowan Breyer," the woman continued. "My grandmother passed away last winter." She swallowed. Her last words were strange. Callum finally looked up. "If you ever find the Ashford family," she told me, "give them everything." The name settled heavily inside the room. Callum's jaw tightened. Very few strangers knew that name. Even fewer spoke it carefully. "You've traveled a long way for people you've never met." She managed a tired smile. "I suppose I have." 3 days earlier, Juniper Hollow had been unusually busy. Autumn always brought wagons loaded with timber, wool, preserved apples, and supplies before mountain passes became difficult. Callum had ridden into town before sunrise to collect fencing wire and horse feed. He preferred arriving early. Fewer conversations, fewer questions. Most folks respected him enough to leave him alone. Bram Hensley, owner of the General Mercantile, greeted him with his usual grin. "You look like somebody who plans on working straight through winter." "That's generally how winter works." Bram laughed. "I've got your order ready." As Callum loaded sacks onto his wagon, another wagon rolled into town. Dust settled around unfamiliar wheels. A lone woman climbed down carrying a worn leather satchel and one carefully protected wooden case. She paused, studying the town as though comparing it to a memory she'd never actually seen. Bram noticed her first. "You looking for someone?" She approached politely. "I'm trying to find the Ashford family." The store suddenly became quiet. Callum froze behind his wagon. Bram glanced toward him before answering carefully. "Depends which Ashford." She reached into her satchel. "I honestly don't know." Callum climbed onto the wagon. He wasn't interested in strangers carrying old stories. Before Bram could speak again, Callum tipped his hat and drove away. He never saw the disappointment cross the woman's face. By afternoon, heavy storm clouds rolled over Juniper Hollow. Rain arrived suddenly. The mountain road disappeared beneath sheets of water. Travel became impossible. Bram found Rowan standing beneath the store awning. "The boarding house is full." She looked toward the darkening sky. "I'll keep traveling." "You won't." She looked confused. "The river crossing floods after storms." He thought for a moment. "There's one place." She followed his gaze toward the hills. The Ashford Ranch. Callum wasn't pleased when someone knocked on his cabin door after sunset. He opened it to find Bram standing beside the soaked traveler. "Sorry to trouble you." "You already have." Bram ignored the remark. "Roads washed out. Boarding house is full. I figured she'd be safer here than sleeping in a wagon." Callum looked toward the rain, then toward the exhausted woman. Finally, he stepped aside. "One night. That's all." She entered quietly. "Thank you." He simply nodded. The cabin reflected the man who lived inside it. Everything had its place. Clean floors, neatly stacked firewood, well-used furniture repaired instead of replaced. No unnecessary decorations. Only one thing seemed out of place. An empty rocking chair beside the fireplace. Rowan noticed it almost immediately. She noticed other things too. A broken music box resting untouched on a shelf. Old family photographs. Military saddlebags hanging carefully near the wall. And every so often, Callum unconsciously touched something hidden inside his vest pocket. Neither mentioned it. Over supper, they exchanged only simple conversation. You're a seamstress? I restore clothing. Old clothing. Mostly family heirlooms. He nodded. People pay for that. They pay for memories. That answer lingered. Rain continued through the following day. Neither seemed in a hurry to fill the silence. Rowan helped prepare breakfast without asking. She repaired a loose kitchen curtain while waiting for water to boil. Callum mended harness leather on the porch. By evening, they had spoken more than either expected. Not about the past. About ordinary things. Mountain winters. Fence repairs. Books. Music. She laughed once after discovering Callum secretly enjoyed reading travel journals despite rarely leaving the valley anymore. I didn't expect that. Most people don't. He almost smiled. Almost. On the third morning, sunlight finally broke through the clouds. Mist drifted across the fields beyond the cabin. The storm had passed. Rowan quietly packed her belongings. Callum hitched her wagon without being asked. Neither seemed eager to mention the real reason she'd come. Finally, she stopped beside the table. I can't leave. He looked at her. Not until I show you something. She slowly removed the folded letter from her satchel. Next came a faded photograph of two young men standing beside a ranch gate nearly 20 years earlier. One was unmistakably Callum. The other, his older brother Rowan. The brother everyone believed had vanished forever. Callum stared without speaking. Then Rowan carefully unwrapped the small linen bundle. A silver pendant slid gently onto the tabletop. Callum's breath caught. His hand instinctively reached inside his vest. He withdrew an identical silver half he had carried every day since Rowan disappeared. With trembling fingers, he placed it beside hers. The edges met perfectly. The broken pendant became whole again. Neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly behind them. Outside, the wind stirred the pine trees. Inside the cabin, 12 years of unanswered questions suddenly felt closer than ever before. Then Callum slowly reached for the unopened letter. His brother's unmistakable handwriting stared back at him from the weathered envelope. He closed his eyes. After all these years, the truth was finally waiting to be read. Callum stared at the unopened envelope for so long that the fire burned low in the hearth. His thumb traced the familiar handwriting across the front. There was no mistake. He had watched his older brother Rowan write countless notes before riding cattle drives across Montana. The firm slant of every letter, the way the A in Ashford leaned slightly to the right, the long stroke beneath his signature, it was all unmistakable. For 12 years, Callum had imagined hundreds of endings. An accident in the mountains, an ambush on a lonely trail, a decision to abandon the family. Never, not once, had he imagined that Rowan's final words had been waiting inside a sealed envelope. His hands trembled as he carefully broke the wax seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the ink remained surprisingly clear. He drew a slow breath before reading aloud. If this letter has finally reached home, then Providence has shown more mercy than I ever deserved. His voice caught. Rowan remained silent, giving him the space to continue. I did not leave because I stopped loving our family. I left because men who believed I carried information they wanted were following me. Had I returned home, every person bearing our name would have been placed in danger. Callum lowered the letter for a moment. His eyes filled with disbelief. He never abandoned us, he whispered. Rowan quietly shook her head. I never believed he did. He looked at her. You never knew him. No, but my grandmother did. She reached into her satchel and removed another folded paper. When I was little, she'd sometimes tell me about a frightened young man who arrived at their farm one winter evening with a wounded horse and almost nothing else. Callum looked up sharply. She never told me his name, only that he carried enormous guilt because people back home would think he'd run away. The room fell silent once more. For nearly an hour they read every page Rowan had written. The story was unlike anything Callum had imagined. Years earlier, Rowan had accepted temporary work escorting payroll wagons for a government freight contractor traveling through the mountains. The convoy had been ambushed. Money disappeared. Several guards blamed Rowan before the investigation had even begun. Rather than risking the accusation spreading to Juniper Hollow, Rowan fled deeper into frontier territory while trying to uncover who had actually orchestrated the theft. He believed he would return within weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. The final page explained everything. I discovered too late that the men responsible had friends in places I could not fight alone. If they learned where my family lived, they would come for you next. I chose absence because it seemed safer than bringing danger home. Callum slowly folded the letter. My mother died believing he simply walked away. His voice was almost inaudible. She waited every spring, every autumn, every Christmas, until waiting became too painful. I never knew. Eloan's own eyes glistened. My grandmother blamed herself. Callum looked up. Why? Because Rowan insisted she never send the letter until she could prove the men hunting him were truly gone. And she kept that promise. For 30 years. The next morning, Callum saddled his horse before sunrise. We're riding into town. Eloan wrapped her scarf tighter against the crisp mountain air. Where? The courthouse. If Rowan was falsely accused. I intend to prove it. Juniper Hollow's courthouse occupied a modest brick building overlooking the town square. Most of its records were stacked inside a cramped archive room that smelled of dust and aging paper. The county clerk, Miriam Beckett, adjusted her spectacles when she saw the old documents spread across her desk. I haven't seen this case in years. She carefully compared Rowan's letter with the surviving payroll investigation. Something immediately caught her attention. These signatures don't match. Callum leaned closer. What do you mean? The witness statement accusing your brother. She pointed toward the page. It was supposedly signed by Deputy Inspector Wallace. She retrieved another ledger from a nearby shelf. Here's Wallace's official signature from the same year. The handwriting looked completely different. Callum frowned. So someone forged it. It certainly appears that way. She continued reading. Then her expression changed again. There's another problem. What? The investigation ended almost immediately. No interviews. No recovered evidence. No follow-up. It looks as though someone wanted the case closed before the truth could come out. That afternoon, Miriam directed them toward the retired circuit judge who had presided over many frontier disputes decades earlier. Judge Edwin Tolliver now lived on a quiet apple farm several miles outside town. Though well into his 70s, his memory remained remarkably sharp. When Callum mentioned Rowan's name, the old man's shoulders sank. I've regretted that case for years. Callum stared at him. You remember? I remember not being allowed to ask enough questions. Judge Tolliver disappeared inside his study before returning with a weathered leather journal. I kept private notes. He opened to a page dated nearly 15 years earlier. There, a handwritten entry read, evidence incomplete. Witness testimony inconsistent. Political pressure increasing. Callum looked up slowly. You believed he was innocent. I believed someone powerful wanted the investigation buried. The judge sighed deeply. I should have fought harder. As daylight faded, Callum and Eloan rode quietly back toward the ranch. Neither spoke for several miles. Finally, Eloan broke the silence. You've carried anger all these years. I have. And now? He watched the evening sun settling behind the mountains. I'm not angry. I'm grieving all over again. She nodded gently. Sometimes the truth hurts before it heals. Callum smiled faintly. My brother spent years protecting people who never knew the sacrifice he made. And your grandmother protected his final words. She looked toward him. Different people. The same courage. That evening, Callum carefully placed Rowan's letter inside a wooden box that had once belonged to his parents. Beside it, he laid the reunited silver pendant. For the first time since Rowan disappeared, those treasured keepsakes no longer represented unanswered questions. They represented hope. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pines surrounding the ranch. Inside, the fire burned warmly as Callum realized something that had seemed impossible only days earlier. His family story was no longer ending in mystery. At long last, it was beginning to find its way toward the truth. The first snow of November dusted the hills surrounding Juniper Hollow when the final piece of Rowan Ashford's story finally came home. For weeks, Callum and Eloan had traveled across neighboring counties, gathering every surviving document they could find. They visited aging churches, county archives, forgotten stagecoach stations, and ranches owned by people whose memories stretched farther than the official records ever had. Little by little, a different portrait of Rowan emerged. He had not disappeared into bitterness. He had disappeared into service. One retired freight driver remembered Rowan repairing broken wagon axles for stranded settlers without accepting payment. A widow recalled how a quiet traveler had left sacks of flour and firewood outside her cabin after her husband died during a brutal winter. An elderly minister produced an old church ledger listing anonymous donations made over several years. Although no name appeared beside the entries, each donation had been delivered by a man wearing half of a silver pendant. Callum recognized the description immediately. His brother had never stopped carrying the other half. He stayed close enough to help people, Callum said softly, but far enough away to protect us. Rowan looked toward the snow-covered hills. Some people spend their whole lives trying to be remembered. She smiled gently. Your brother spent his trying to make sure others survived. A month later, Judge Edwin Tolliver submitted every recovered document to the Territorial Review Board. The investigation that had once lasted only a few hurried days now filled nearly 200 pages. Witness statements, handwriting comparisons, private journals, financial ledgers, church records, letters. Together they revealed what had been hidden for over a decade. The accusations against Rowan had been built on forged testimony and incomplete evidence. The real thieves had manipulated frightened officials into closing the case before the truth could surface. Just before Christmas, the board issued its decision. Rowan Ashford was officially declared innocent. Every charge was withdrawn. His name was restored. When the news reached Juniper Hollow, the church bells rang before noon. By evening, nearly the entire town had gathered outside the courthouse. People who had once whispered about the Ashford family now removed their hats in quiet respect. Callum accepted the written declaration with both hands. He didn't make a speech. He simply looked toward the winter sky. I hope you know, he whispered. We finally brought you home. Life at the ranch slowly settled into a peaceful rhythm. Rowan had planned to leave long before winter arrived. Instead, she found herself staying another week. Then another. There was always another quilt needing careful repair. Another family Bible with a broken leather cover. Another faded wedding dress someone hoped could be preserved. Word spread quickly that the gifted seamstress staying at Ashford Ranch could restore almost anything touched by time. Travelers began arriving with carefully wrapped family treasures. Callum watched as strangers left carrying more than repaired belongings. They carried stories they thought had been lost forever. One afternoon, he found Rowan carefully stitching the torn edge of a Civil War flag for an elderly veteran. You charge far less than your work is worth, he observed. She smiled without looking up. My grandmother used to say memories belong to families. We're only borrowing them long enough to mend them. Callum leaned against the doorway. You've done the same for mine. She paused for a heartbeat. Neither spoke again. Some truths didn't require words. Winter settled fully over Montana. Snow covered the fences. Smoke curled steadily from the ranch house chimney. The empty rocking chair beside the fireplace no longer stood untouched. Neighbors often occupied it during evening gatherings. Music returned to the cabin. So did laughter. For the first time since Rowan's disappearance, Ashford Ranch felt like a home instead of a monument to grief. One evening, Bram Hensley stopped by with supplies. He looked around the lively cabin before smiling at Callum. I haven't seen this place this full in 15 years. Callum followed his gaze. Rowan was teaching Odessa Vale how to repair delicate lace. Judge Tolliver sat nearby playing checkers with two visiting ranch hands. Coffee simmered over the stove. Fresh bread cooled beside the window. Without realizing it, the lonely ranch had quietly become the heart of the community. By early spring, Rowan finally packed her traveling wagon. Callum helped load the last wooden chest. Neither seemed eager to acknowledge what both already knew. I suppose this is goodbye, she said softly. He rested one hand on the wagon rail. I've been thinking. She waited. This ranch has room for horses, cattle, fields. He smiled. But it doesn't have a proper restoration workshop. She looked at him curiously. You've spent months bringing forgotten histories back to life. I don't think Juniper Hollow should lose that. He reached into his coat pocket. Instead of handing her money, he unfolded a simple sketch. It showed a bright workshop beside the barn. Large windows, shelves, work tables, a small reading room for old journals and family records. I drew this. She studied the paper in silence. You planned all this. I hoped. He took a careful breath. I'm not asking you to stop traveling because I need someone to fill an empty house. I'm asking whether you'd consider building something here with me. Tears shimmered in her eyes. You mean the workshop? He smiled. The workshop, the ranch, the life that comes with both. She laughed softly through happy tears. You always did choose your words carefully. I've had years of practice. She folded the drawing with extraordinary care. I'd like to stay. 3 years later, visitors traveled from across Montana Territory to Ashford Ranch. Some came for cattle. Many came carrying trunks filled with old letters, military medals, faded photographs, quilts, journals, and forgotten keepsakes. A carved wooden sign welcomed them. Ashford Heritage House. Inside, Rowan carefully restored treasured family possessions, while Callum documented the stories behind each one. Together, they created an annual frontier heritage gathering where families shared forgotten histories before time could erase them. The reunited silver pendant rested inside a glass case above the fireplace. Whenever visitors admired it, Callum always smiled. They asked why it's broken. He gently lifted both joined halves. It never truly was. It was simply waiting for the right hands to bring it home. Across the room, Rowan looked up from restoring another faded letter. Their eyes met. Years earlier, she had stood in this very cabin, frightened and uncertain, asking only for one thing. Please, just look. He had. And because he chose to look instead of turning away, a grieving family found peace, an honorable man reclaimed his name, and two lonely lives discovered a future they never expected. Sometimes the smallest request changes everything. Sometimes healing begins with nothing more than the courage to unfold an old letter. And sometimes, the greatest journeys do not begin on horseback. They begin when one person decides to believe another's quiet truth.